post did not come. As anyone who has been unfortunate enough to experience such an event will know, an absent post is keenly felt. It being the 26th of March, many of the villagers laughed that the postman, having spent the previous week reminding each household that summertime would begin that Sunday, had at last forgotten and overslept himself. However, once the news had reached Mrs. Coulsley that her husband had made no deliveries that morning, and she had assured her neighbours that she had seen Mr. Coulsley off at the usual hour in accordance with British summertime, those smiles became somewhat anxious, and people began to ask what could have befallen their postman, and some feared the worst. The worst had not happened, but what did occur caused a sensation nonetheless. 1922. The sun never sets on the British Empire, which has never been so vast nor so unstable. It is still the envy of nations, and its 500 million people, its mighty navy, its flag on every sea, its stronghold in every continent, its power and glory shining splendid. The imperialist heart thrills at the new mandates in Mesopotamia, Palestine, and Transjordan. But it is not what it once was. India, jewel in the crown, the archetype of empire, is once again restive under the Raj. When Home Rule had been asked for, the Indian National Congress considers diarchy a rather anemic response to 74,000 soldiers killed in Europe's war. The ascetic Mr. Gandhi, with his egalitarian vision of independence, which celebrates the subcontinent's multiplicity of religions, regions, languages, and traditions, inspires the peasantry as institutional politics never has. 5,000 miles northwest, right at the beating heart of the empire, from within the United Kingdom itself, Ireland, the oldest colony, is struggling to hack itself free from 7 centuries of subjection, but has left the northwest of itself behind. Look back a moment, past the Great War, to the turn of the century and the existential shock of the Boer War. How could it be that a few thousand Boers had stood out against the full imperational might for 32 long, grinding, bloody months? A Pyrrhic victory it was, which robbed Britain of its taste for glory, when germinated the seeds of disillusionment in the bedrock of imperialism, whose branches will grow up through the class hierarchies which support the empire, whose roots will one day grow so mighty as to crack the foundations of what once seemed an indefatigable fact, but not yet. In the motherland, suffice to say that the young men and women who would once have gone empire building have little appetite for adventure now. Those who survived the war to end all wars came back to Blighty with a wish to settle down and enjoy those ideals they had been defending: peace, liberality, self-determination. So what if Britain now ruled the Holy City, or the land of the Garden of Eden? The Middle East stuck in the mind for the squalid siege of Kut al-Amara and the tragic farce at Gallipoli. Give us rather homes fit for heroes. But that hope had been cut down by the Geddes axe. The last man was barely demobbed before the peace boom was over. 2 years of slump, and though wages are up, so are strikes, and jobs are very much down. Many a man who was still deployed in December 19 and didn't get to cast his newly bestowed vote has taken direct action as a means of making his politics felt. The governing classes are consumed by the potential catastrophes of the country's enormous war debts and the failing recovery of its own European debtors. A resurgent Turkey, an expansionist Japan, nationalist colonies, lack of capital, a feeble pound, and most luridly of all, the contagion of Bolshevism. Bolshevism, a term which has come to encompass everything from bloody revolution to a higher rate of national insurance. The trouble is that the working classes now have votes, and no tradition of voting Liberal or Conservative. War has left them better travelled, better educated, and better paid, less willing to accept what their betters give them and be thankful, and the Labour Party is still an unknown quantity. But these are the affairs of nations. We, for the moment, are concerned with a small Dartmoor village and the whereabouts of its postman. He has been found unconscious in a hedge. The village of Nethercott is situated in the northern part of the moor, not far from the bounds of the ancient royal forest. It is a pretty place, with all the usual integrants one would expect to find in an English village. Charming stone cottages inhabited by fresh-faced rustics, a few larger, more regularly proportioned buildings housing the bourgeoisie, a bakery and dairy, a butcher's, a forge, the Three Hares Inn, and, most fortunately for our story, a post office and general store. A tea room opened in previous century, when the railway was extended to Edgemoor, a town approximately 4 miles of good road to the east. And it overlooks the large village green, dotted with mature beech trees, which offer shade in summer and shelter from the rain in all seasons. The Georgian-built rectory likewise fronts the green, and situated behind it is an unusually grand church for such a small village. The church house, constructed principally in 16th century, was long ago the scene of parish brewing and feasting, all profits of which went to the church rather than the feudal lord. Such diabolic practices were extinguished by Cromwell's protectorate, and following the Restoration, it was converted to almshouses. Since Victoria's coronation, it has been the village school, those individuals then in a position to sponsor such an enterprise, and believing education to be a public good, considering the walk to Edgemoor too far for little legs. Several farms skirt the village, and moorland spreads out in every direction. The dull green slopes criss-crossed by dry stone walls, sprinkled with snowy sheep, shaggy black and brown Galloways, and small, sturdy Dartmoor ponies. Spitchwickard Hall, the great house located 2 miles north of the village, is home to the eponymous squire and his family. Their estate extends over most of the parish, including most of the village buildings and much of the livestock to be seen grazing the thin grass, lying in the heather, and skirting the sharp gorse, belongs to their tenants. One of the few farms not owned by the Spitchwickards is Greenwood, 20 minutes walk westwards from the church. To the southeast, on the far side of Cameldown Hill, is Edgemoor Quarry, where many of the farm labourers find employment during the winter months. It would not be quite fair to say that there was no post that morning. The few cottages on the road leading out of the village towards the South Long farms had all received their letters, as had most of the farmhouses. At last a search party was got up and followed Jed Causley's usual morning route, calling for him as they went, the 2 dogs that accompanied them running ahead and skipping back as though to chivvy the men along. The spring of 1922 was not a pleasant one. It was as though winter, having spent January and February rather idly, had decided to make up for lost time. The cold morning was blustery and changeable. Patches of white cloud were blown rapidly across the sun by northwesterly gusts and clustered together above Cameldown. In a short time, the dogs led the search party to a pair of boots sticking out of the hedge, growing over a stone wall, the spot clearly marked by the bicycle leaning beside it. The boots were smartly polished, though recently smudged with mud and laced up to the ankle, and the tops disappeared into a pair of dark blue trousers. Further investigation established that the rest of the postman was also in the hedge. His head and shoulders, in fact, had fallen through to the other side, soundly asleep. 2 men held his ankles, 2 more reached through to grab hold of his upper arms, and on the count of 3 they hauled him out, droplets of water shaking from the foliage and splashing the nape of the neck in a most unpleasant way. They propped him on the wall, where he had obviously been sitting when he fell asleep, and when rousing Causley proved surprisingly difficult, a lad was dispatched to run back to the village and fetch Dr. Foxworthy, while the remainder continued their efforts. When he at last came to, Jed Causley was very confused. He gazed with bewilderment at the semicircle of grinning farmers in front of him, at the bedraggled state of his clothes. He looked indeed as though he'd been dragged through a hedge backwards. At his service wristwatch, which seemed to be telling him it was 10 o'clock, while they related the narrative of his disappearance and discovery to him, Causley made several movements which suggested he was looking for something, though as he didn't say what, nobody asked him. Eventually, he interrupted them. "My flask is gone." "What flask?" "You must have dropped it when you fell asleep." He stood up to begin a search of his own, and swayed dangerously. Someone steadied him under the arms and helped him stagger back to the wall. He moved his head slowly, as though trying to clear it, or to shake away the buzzing noises of amused concern coming from his audience. "Oh, you weren't asleep," he insisted. "I couldn't have been." "You must have been. We found you in the edge." "But ow!" At this point, the doctor was seen cycling down the lane, the postmaster running heavily several yards behind him. Dr. Foxworthy listened to a garbled history of the patient's condition on discovery while examining his head for contusions. He examined the patient's pupils, asked him to count the number of fingers the doctor held before him, pronounced him apparently healthy, if somewhat chilled and disorientated, and recommended the postmaster finish his round. Causley got to his feet a second time, but still it was no good. He staggered again and grabbed hold of the doctor's shoulder as a fixed point in the universe. Dr. Foxworthy suppressed a wince and sat the patient down again, inquiring if he had eaten that morning. Causley described the breakfast his wife had cooked and the tea in his flask. Dr. Foxworthy asked if he had added anything to his flask. After all, the day's work cold and gloomy. When the postman began his work, no one could blame him for adding a nip of something to keep off the chill. The postmaster looked scandalized at this, and Causley strenuously denied doing any such thing. He took his duties as postman very seriously. What was more, he had taken the pledge some years ago, and in any case, he hoped even a teetotaler could hold out against a drop in his tea. Dr. Foxworthy frowned, and allowed the strength of this argument. He sent one of the assembled men to ask for the use of a cart from somewhere farm to convey Causley back to Nethercot. As he was still unstable, and if he stayed out much longer, the cold might do him real mischief, and told the rest of the small crowd that they could go back to work. "Well, Jed," said the postmaster, as the audience dispersed, "why don't you tell us what happened?" Causley began relating his journey out of the village that morning, which houses had received how many letters, and how, cycling along the empty Camel-Down road, the light grew stronger and the moorland colours came to life. He had stopped, as he did every morning, on the wall where he sat now. It was an ideal spot for his first break, south-facing, so that he got the sun's warmth on the days when it shone, and sheltered by an arbour-like hollow in the hedge which kept the rain off. He'd taken his thermos, a present from Mrs. Causley last Christmas, from a pannier, and poured himself a cup of tea. He remembered blowing on it, taking a sip, and then another, and then he wasn't sure what had happened. And then you must have fallen asleep, remarked the doctor. But I can't have done, insisted the patient. Even if I had gone asleep, surely I'd have woken up when the branch gave way. You put nothing extra in my tea, doctor? Mr. Holburton? Nothing. Are you still awake?
Yes, I was listening. I think I think one of the things that you said was that Maeve had wanted to write mystery novels that didn't necessarily have a dead body. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, and she does that, doesn't she? With that opening, the worst had not happened. So she's kind of prefiguring the disappointment. But the funny thing is that the American professor who read the whole book, she's convinced that there's a corpse in this story. So, and I know why she thinks that, because it is written. She has stuck to the genre, and so there's a great chapter. I nearly chose it, and then I thought it's too long. That opening is long enough, but where the suspense is built and you are left not knowing. But the fact is, there is not a single body in the whole book. And that's how she wanted the whole series to be. She wanted to play around with the expectation of death, which is horribly poignant when you think about what happened to her, without actually giving you a corpse, so that you would recognize. I mean, for anyone who knows anything about literature and analysis of literature, it's postmodernism, right? She's quoting lots of other books, which most writers do, but she's doing it in a self-conscious way, and she's playing around with the genre. And actually, although this is kind of constructed as detective fiction in the way that it was at the time, it's very popular. It's been a popular form for a long time. It's, still one of the most popular forms. It is actually a spy story, which we will come on to if we've got time. Dan, how are we doing for time? Because I realise, lots of people with ME will be wanting to listen to this, and I guess it can be broken down. But how are we doing for time? How are you doing for time yourself?
Yeah, we've got. I'm all right. I'm quite happy just listening, but we've gone about 56 minutes. So we could turn it into 2, or we could just keep going, and then people can sort of listen and then come back to it and listen to the rest, because it's kind of useful. You can just sort of pause a podcast and come and listen to it again. So yeah, we can keep going.
Let's
I
keep
think there's a
going.
couple
I
more
mean, I'm
excerpts
really
that you've
happy
got,
to
haven't
just keep going. I'm not the best reader in the world, but and I might have to get myself a glass of water. But yeah, it
fine.
gives me nothing but pleasure to read that book. So thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Was there anything else in that that jumped out at you that you want to ask about or talk about, or maybe press on?
I think on the one hand, you get a rich sense of the community and the location, and you're right there, aren't you? In you can sort of put yourself in that situation from a description just of the global events, and then the sort of local kind of scene, and then what it did for me when I read it is I just wanted to know what happened next, and
Isn't that
or I
great?
wanted to know
Yeah.
why this post.
Yeah.
I just wanted to know why the postman had ended up in the bush, and
Yeah.
nobody seemed to believe him. I think it's that kind of sense of everybody placing their own expectation or their own version of events on the story, in the sense of well, he must have been drinking, or you've fallen asleep, or and actually there's something else that's happened, but that seems to have been downplayed, and I guess we get a sense of that a little bit more with the detective that comes in a bit, don't we? So maybe that's
But I
a good
just love
place
the
to go
way that
next.
she's kind of captured. Sorry, I'm talking over you, but she's kind of captured the thing about village gossip. Like, this is how gossip is made. Everyone's got an opinion, and they all share it amongst themselves. And then, can you just and to come back to ME, which is how we're both here. it's the same with ME, right? Everyone's got an opinion. Nobody knows, and nobody will ask or believe the person who knows. So there he is. That, you know, this is our first doctor note. And there are other doctors, and there was a whole. So I couldn't include it, but it is such a great. It's really, really lovely little snippet. There's a cottage hospital, and one of her central characters is a lady doctor who we will hear about, but because it was very difficult for women to get any kind of recognition. And I don't think that it's an accident that, you know, 75% of people with ME are women, and it is very difficult for ME to get recognised. I do think that there's a kind of a historical and ongoing prejudice in that, which she has captured. So this doctor, he will come back in what we're going to hear about. But only at the margin, we'll be pleased to hear. And he seems quite, you know, like respectable and innocuous, but just the way in which, you know, he tells them they can all go back to work now, as if work is the only thing they're there for. You know, that's the only thing that can really matter. And the way that if you've got a chronic illness, you are prevented from working because you are not well enough to work, and that then invalidates you. You know, that you are no longer valid. You've become an invalid is another thing that she, I mentioned that to you before. She played around with words a lot, and the idea of whether or not a person was valid because of their illness really hurt her a lot, because she was so capable, like so many people who were not well enough to work and yet had been invalidated. So the next bit that I want to read, if you're happy for me to just skip on, is a much shorter extract, because there are so many characters, and as she says in her introductory chapter, she was interested in the class structure and class difference, and the idea of equality, and how possible it is for people to be equal, and what the barriers to being treated equally are. And this little bit is about one of the servants in the household of the central character. So there are 4 siblings, 3 surviving, and Apolline is the central character, although sometimes it is hard to tell that. And that's maybe one of the things about this being a first draft novel. You're not really sure who is taking you through the narrative, but Apolline is the younger sister, and she really is the central character. And here is Grace, one of their servants, with Apolline. So this Saturday afternoon found Grace at the kitchen table with Apolline polishing silver. This evening they would serve celery soup, baked chicken with noodles and spring greens, and steamed lemon pudding, pale colours of fresh flavours reflecting the lengthening days, while hinting at the brighter shades of spring still to come. Grace selected the embroidered tablecloth, as the subtle hues of the food would be nicely complemented by the delicate white stitching. It was a difficult time of year for flowers, too late for snowdrops, but too early for much other than narcissi, unless it had been particularly warm. But on Thursday, she had asked the gardener to pot up several white hyacinths from the cold frame on the point of flowering, and they had unfurled in the warmth of the kitchen. She carried them through to the drawing room and placed the brass bowl on the sideboard against the long wall opposite the fireplace. The curling petals glowed before the rich, dark tones of the wallpaper, and their sweet, fresh scent diffused through the room. She crossed to the grate and set a match to the arrangement of newspaper and kindling, watching the pine cones become consumed by flame before placing the logs on top. Emerging back into the hallway, she met Apolline elegantly dressed in ochre silk. "You have a moment, Grace?" "Yes, of course." Apolline led her back into the dining room. "I have invited Herr Leitner to join us this evening, because I want to—" She paused, seeking the right word. "Take his measure. I'd be very grateful if you could keep half an eye on him." "Miss?" "No special attentions or anything like that. Just keep him on a long lead. Just if you happen to notice anything I don't, afterwards, to let me know." "Of course. Nothing to worry about." She smiled reassuringly and looked round the room. "Goodness, it's lovely in here. You've done a wonderful job, as always." Grace gave her a gratified smile and returned to the kitchen. When she went into the drawing room a little while later, she found Apolline and Inigo seated beside the fire, discussing Mariah's birthday. "Why don't we get to a gramophone?" "Really?" "Yes." Inigo frowned. "We'll let people know discreetly, and they could give her records." Apolline smiled encouragingly. He continued to look sceptical. "Don't worry," she added. "I'll do all the legwork. I'll go to Exeter and choose the right model." "Are you sure Mariah will like one? Being musical herself, I mean." "You're worried you won't like it. This is the same argument we had over the car." "Not quite. I understand the utility of the car," Inigo began, eyes moving back to his reading. "What point the gramophone?" "The point? Enjoyment, entertainment, fun." Inigo looked over the paper at her, eyebrows raised, and she saw that he was joking. "Am I really such a desperate case?" he asked. Smiling to herself, Grace set down her tray of glasses. As the clock in the hallway finished striking 6, there were sounds of approach on the gravel, and Grace went to answer the door. "It isn't fair of you to tease me," Apolline protested. "I can never tell whether you're serious or not. A gramophone is an excellent idea. I'll go next week." So this is in anticipation of a dinner party. So this family of unusual people, let's say, live on Dartmoor, which is very remote, and for society, they alternate dinner parties with friends in Edgemoor. So they take it in turns, and it's the turn of their house at Greenwood to host the dinner party, which is why Grace is paying so much attention to it, and takes so much pride in the home, in looking after the home. And we'll hear a little bit more about her in a minute. I cut the next bits just because they are really interesting, but they develop the characters and the kind of social context, historical and social context, as in the class differences and how Apolline's family, or Apolline at least in her family, is trying to overcome some of those differences and iron out, level things out. But the plot gets furthered on Tuesday, the 18th of April. So that was the other thing about the way she organised it, is she's organised it around specific dates for her first draft, so that the time is continuous. The chapters aren't, I don't need to get into too many technical details, but hopefully when it's published, hopefully it will get published, it'll be self-evident. So this one, Tuesday the 18th of April, Busman's Holiday. Nothing came of Causley's actions for more than a fortnight, you will recall. And then in brackets, she's got here Easter farming observance, because she'd started drafting knowing that she'd have to go back and fill in factual details. Like with the name earlier, she didn't have names for everybody or everything, so there's just a blank, which is going to be a challenge for publishing. But anyway, anyone's got any ideas, let me know. So it was not in fact, it was not until Tuesday after Easter that the first consequences became manifest. This was not because Jed Causley was in any way behindhand in reporting his concerns to the postmaster, and Mr. Holberton promptly passed on the suspicion of interference with His Majesty's mails to the Edgemore Police, who forwarded it to the Criminal Investigation Department at Exeter. The trouble was that the minor inconvenience of a parcel apparently going missing for a few days before being found and promptly delivered was not considered to be a police matter after all. When the Nethercott Post Office had heard nothing for over a week, Mr. Holberton placed a call to Exeter CID himself and insisted on speaking to a detective regarding this very serious incident. This occurred on the Thursday before Good Friday, and there was some excitement over Easter at the prospect of a real detective coming to do his investigating in Nethercott. But it was not until Tuesday that Detective Sergeant George Love was instructed by his superiors to take the train out to Dartmoor and find out what was troubling the locals. D.S. Love arrived on a glorious April morning, the landscape glistening from early showers and lemony with sharp sunshine. This case had been given to him as a sort of treat for being on duty over Easter. There was nothing more serious on his plate back in Exeter than a few burglaries, and he stepped off the 9:45 in something of a holiday mood. It is true that he had not been exactly cheerful since 1916, but he was capable of enjoying a fine spring day on the moor. He dropped in at the Edgemore police station out of courtesy to the local sergeant, and with the unspoken hope that someone would give him a lift to Nethercott. P.S. Collamore himself drove them in the station trap, and explained on the way to Holberton. Though liable to be a bit old womanish, it was a sensible man. That Holberton, though liable to be a bit old womanish, was a sensible man at bottom. However, it was Collamore's understanding that the matter concerned a postman who had had one measure too many to keep out the cold, and he was damned if he could see why they were bothering CID about it. He also informed Love that Nethercott's only resident alien had permission to travel to London this morning and had left first thing, and probably passed Love at Exeter St. David's, and would not return until tomorrow. Having said his piece, Collamore was quite capable of silence, and so for the remainder of the journey Love enjoyed the crystalline air and pastoral sounds of chirping birds and clopping hooves, only slightly marred once by the distant klaxon of the quarry warning of imminent detonation. It was cold up here, and he noticed that the spring flowers were a few weeks behind his own garden. Collamore set Love down by the Nethercott post office and general store, and he soon found himself closeted with the ultimately sensible Holberton and his errant postman. Jed Causley, evidently aware of the ethanolic rumours, was quick to refute any suggestion that he had been drinking. He gave Love the history of his adventure, supported with observations about stamps, the absence of his thermos, the testimony of the postmaster when possible, Having established that the post office had no idea as to who might wish to interfere with the course of their duties, Love said that he thought he had better interview the parcel's recipient, one Miss Apolline Orchard, in case she could shed any light, and was promptly furnished with directions to Greenwood. They're a funny lot, Holberton reflected aloud, once he had finished describing the meanderings of the road. Young Mr. Orchard's right enough, Methodist, proper gentlemanly, though that don't stop him getting his hands dirty and doing a real bit of farming. My cousin Job's one of his labourers, and he treats them very handsome. That youngest sister's a one, though. Went abroad at 17 and married a German Jew. He weren't German, Causley interrupted. It was Austria they went to. Same difference, ain't it? Said Holberton dismissively. And a Hebrew just the same. He's dead now, but it makes you wonder. Both the Orchard girls came back in 19. Shameful, some said, how they weren't here to see their parents buried, but that were before the armistice, so I don't rightly see how they could have, for they were out of the country the whole war. Now, I'll agree with you there, Mr. Holberton, and I'll go no further. My wife's niece Gracie is housemaid up at Greenwood, and they treat her as right, pay her so well she could live home, but she prefers it up there, said Causley, in a tone which seemed to ask if anyone ever heard of anything more remarkable. Alice Innocent, as came with Mrs. Orchard as her maid back in the 90s, when old Mr. Orchard brought his bride home, she's housekeeper now, and Gracie says as she loves that family more than her own back up north. They're a wealthy family, then? Asked Love, thinking he'd hit on the reason such a fuss had been made over a bit of delayed post. Well, you wouldn't call them church mice, chuckled Mr. Holberton. They're well off, said Causley, with more consideration. They've a motor car and a telephone, but I don't know as you'd rightly call them wealthy. They aren't up with the Spitchwickards. Though perhaps the land tax made them more or less even, Holberton put in. Seems to me the only thing you might really call extravagant is what they pay their servants. Gracie has her own bedroom and a little parlour. A right little establishment she's got up there. Still, the slump's been hard on a lot of people. Where does their money come from? The Dartmoor village seemed an unlikely spot to find war profiteers, but you never knew. Causley shrugged. They always had plenty. Holberton cut in with his superior knowledge. Mr. Orchard, what built the house back in 18 made his fortune in the Navy, won the farm off a Spitchwickard in a game of cards. Love raised his eyebrows. And more recently? Well, of course, there's no money in farming these days, but money sticks to money, don't it? If their comfort was sustained by war profits, clearly it wasn't generally known. Holberton was still talking. There's none round as had dealings with that family, whatever had none to complain of. Except the Spitchwickards, perhaps, but that's generations back. And then Mr. Maximilian dying in the war, when he might easily have got an exemption, very honourable. All the same, though, there's something about them sisters. A bit of what you might call epileptic, like the Brimblecombe's girl. Don't talk rubbish, cried Causley unexpectedly. Epileptic? Little Sally Brimblecombe, I should know, insisted Holberton. I've seen her have fits. Her mother's my second cousin, but not the Orchard sisters. Eccentric, you mean? That's as maybe, Holberton pushed on, unwilling to be corrected by his subordinate in the presence of a policeman. But there's many would say they're peculiar. Funny ideas, trousers and universities and unsuitable connections. Fabins, too, them and their friends. But not what there's any harm in them. Who? Were you in the war, Mr. Causley? Asked Love. I was. My 3 brothers too, and only 2 of us come back. Regiment. And I never had shell shock, nor war neurosis, nor anything like that, he said, becoming emphatic. And I ain't touched liquor since 1918. I'm not imagining things. Somebody interfered with that parcel. I know it, and Miss Orchard knew it too. It might have been a misunderstanding or a joke even. Might have been, Causley said laconically, but interfering with His Majesty's mails is a crime, if it were meant to be funny or not. Well, thank you, Mr. Holberton. Mr. Causley, you've been very helpful. Love lied. One last thing. Are there any other foreigners living in or around the village? It was a pleasant walk across the green and down the road lined with thatched cottages, and 2 ladies sitting together in the tea-room, watching the stranger with interest. Love soon left the houses behind and began to climb the hill on the far side of the village. The road was walled with high banks of earth, from the top of which grew slender ash trees, their branches curving towards each other far above his head, their filigree of spring leaves luminous in the sunshine. He walked briskly, letting his arms swing and feeling his blood rising with the sap, a little short of breath, but altogether feeling vigorous and healthy and grateful to be alive. At the top of the hill, the banks became hedgerow, and a bend in the lane brought him in sight of a gap marked by 2 stone posts. The simple 5-bar gate, left open during the day. The right-hand post, which took the latch, was more elaborate than its pair, having for a finial the carved head of the Green Man. As he got closer, Love saw a sign on the top bar of the gate, painted in Gothic lettering, Greenwood. The house was an elegant Georgian construction, stuccoed, with one large sash on either side of the neoclassical porch on the ground floor, and 3 slightly smaller windows on the story above. No one was visible in these front rooms. The gravel crunched as Love crossed the sweep, and he listened for the barking within, but none came. He'd been told that Greenwood was a working farm, and speculated that the obligatory dog was out on the land. The wide front door was shut against the chance of rain. It had no knocker, but a bell in the wall beside it, with a knob which had to be pulled out to ring. He waited for half a minute, wondering if there would be objections to his not having used the tradesman's entrance, before the sound of a door opening close within was followed by the appearance of a young woman in maid's uniform, probably the Gracie whom Crosby had mentioned. "Good morning. I am Detective Sergeant George Love, from Exeter CID. He showed his warrant card. "Here to speak with Miss Apolline Orchard." "Please excuse me, but Miss Orchard is working until 11:30. You would be welcome to come in and wait." Love's wristwatch showed 15:15. "This really won't take long. I'm very sorry. Miss Orchard asked specifically not to be disturbed." "All right, then I'll wait," he said, repressing a flare of irritation, and she showed him into the room, left of the front door. "You'd be Miss Grace Daring, yes? Have you missed any post, or had anything arrive later than expected?" "No, sir. All my family live in the village. I hardly ever get letters." He declined her offers of refreshment, then to take his hat and coat, and she left him alone. Absently turning his old Homburg over and over, he reflected that her Devonshire accent was very slight, and wondered if this was due to her own effort, or an affectation demanded by employers who would not countenance 15 minutes' inconvenience. His own accent had been exorcised from him in grammar school. This picture did not exactly fit with employers who overpaid their servants. Then again, perhaps they were reasonably paid for what was asked of them. He shrugged off his irritation, and noticed the room he was standing in. The window he had seen from the front faced east, but the southern wall was twice as long, with 2 large sashes flanking the generous fireplace and set in to make window seats. The alcoves at each end were filled up with shelves, perfectly positioned for books to protect the spines from sunlight. The late morning sunshine lit up the garden beyond and slanted brilliantly through the 3 windows to illuminate the furnishings. The drawing-room was a model of fine taste in the arts and crafts mode, but a taste that had nothing to prove and valued comfort. It had probably been decorated in the last century, he thought. It was somewhat faded, in such a way as did not detract from the whole, but rather prevented it from being overwhelming. The walls were papered with an elaborate pattern of large curling leaves, redolent of the Green Man's foliage, in a mixture of deep greens and purplish hues, which glowed in the sunlight. The preponderance of the furniture looked to be as old as the house, including a magnificent escritoire, which reached as high as the picture rail and had more drawers than an apothecary's cabinet, though an octagonal table and several revolving bookcases looked to be Edwardian. The upholstered seats were covered with shades of green velvet, which complemented the paper, while the thick carpet over the slate flags was all warmth. Love relaxed, despite himself, as the room enfolded him, the leaves seeming to unfurl from the walls and embrace him, while an armchair, perfectly positioned to catch the sun, glowed invitingly. Miss Orchard had in fact made no such specification against interruption, but Grace, conscious of her mistress's habit of wearing trousers when she was not expecting company, decided that Apolline would appreciate more than a moment's notice that a detective from Exeter wished to speak to her. Having deposited the detective in the drawing-room, Grace slipped away into the library, where Apolline was in truth working, to apprise her of this. Apolline took the back stairs to her bedroom, and several minutes later descended the main staircase in costume, with hair and face arranged. A dark grey cloud sailed inexorably across the sky, and the drawing-room felt cold in the sudden absence of sunshine. At the sound of the door opening, Love turned from the bookshelves, whose contents he'd been examining, to see a dark-haired woman whom he hoped was Miss Orchard. She was. She was not the officious, ageing spinster he had been hypothesizing. He put her at around 30. Possibly a sweetheart killed in the war had left her a superfluous woman, not ugly, but nothing remarkable to look at. If George had been a lesser detective, he'd have left it at that. However, he thought, that wasn't quite right. She had a remarkably bland face, as inscrutable as her plain skirt and beige jersey, which didn't suit her. Difficult, even for his policeman's mind, to commit to memory. The eyes slid past her somehow, yet he had the indefinable sense that this was an affected expression, that she had been used to making her face a blank, which observers might project anything onto. Love introduced himself and explained his presence, and received an apology for having been kept waiting. Mr. Coulsley tells me you regularly receive packages from Germany, and he believes that one of these went missing on, he consulted his notebook, Saturday the 25th of March, in what he considers to be suspicious circumstances. Yes, he's been very zealous about the matter. The voice was as bland as the face, upper middle class and unmemorable. It coincided with a rather unpleasant experience for him. This particular parcel was delivered several days later. Nothing appears to be amiss with the contents. What were the contents? He asked, a little abruptly. I translate one of Germany's leading chemistry journals for Alain Laboratories. There are 2 issues a week. Love wrote this down. Is there much call for this sort of work? There has been a boycott of German science since the war, which naturally extends to their publications, but certain industries, pharmaceuticals and chemical dyes mostly, are still German specialities, being much better prepared for war. Their industries weren't suspended or destroyed by it. Most English scientists don't want to read German literature these days, but it's sensible to keep an eye on what's being published all the same. Are your neighbours aware that you regularly receive post from Germany? As he questioned her, Apolline noticed, his face was turned towards his notebook as though that were the object of his gaze, while in fact his eyes watched her from beneath the pale brow. It isn't a secret, she said, though I don't advertise the fact. I've discussed some of the articles with friends to whom I thought they'd be of interest, and Herr Leitner has remarked upon them as evidence of my proficiency in German. You don't think it's probable, then, that your post is being targeted because of its origin? It seems to be common knowledge that you spent the war in Switzerland. Some people may have drawn certain conclusions from that. I doubt it. Herr Leitner would be the Swiss gentleman staying in the village? Yes. Are you friendly with him? We've had him to dinner once or twice. A stranger in a strange land. You weren't acquainted during the war? I had never met him before he came to Nethercott in February. For effect, he consulted his notebook before continuing. Our records have a Frau Feuerstein living at this address, formerly of Austrian citizenship. I'd have thought Herr Leitner would enjoy the opportunity of some German conversation. Frau Feuerstein, as you so properly call her, is my sister, Sergeant, and she has very little German. Love wondered how she and Feuerstein had managed to communicate to the point of marriage. What's more, Apolline continued, I believe Herr Leitner hopes his sojourn here will improve his English. I see. And Herr Feuerstein? Deceased. My sympathies. He paused out of respect before continuing. Who else lives here besides? My brother, Inigo Orchard, Miss Grace Daring you've met, and Mrs. Alice Innocen, our cook housekeeper. No Mr. Innocen? No. There never had been one, but one can't call a cook housekeeper Miss. I see, and none of them have missed any post. Not so far as I'm aware. He paused then, thinking he might as well be thorough. Said, Feuerstein is a Jewish name, I believe. Yes. Inwardly, Apolline was taken aback. This possibility had not occurred to her. Might your post have been targeted because of this? I shouldn't have thought so. Many people blamed the Jews for the war, suspecting them of sympathy with the Germans. Perhaps the combination. Many people blame the Jews for everything, she thought, but did not say. If anyone took that much issue with my sister's marriage, I imagine they would have made their displeasure more directly felt. Besides, the delayed parcel was addressed to me, not Mrs. Feuerstein. As you say, there's nothing particular, I suppose, about Allain Laboratories. It sounds far-fetched, but there's no reason anyone might not want you or your employer to read something in that journal. There's nothing missing from it. There have been no problems with delivery since. And, well, if you wanted to keep something secret, you wouldn't publish it. I'm sorry, Detective, but I think more serious concern is what happened to Jed Causley, and I don't think my parcel can shed any light on that. Well, thank you for your time, Miss Orchard, he said, with a respectful nod. He saw himself out. It was a pity, he thought, that he did not have cause to make a search. He would very much like to see the rest of that house. D.S. Love fastened his Burberry and turned the collar up against the chill southwester. It started to spit as he thumped back down the hill, struggling against the gravity, threatening to pull him head over heels. It was gone noon by the time he reached the village again, and he was glad to turn in at the Three Hares for dinner. He ordered the mild ale and decided to try a piece of pigeon pie. Chatting with the landlord, Tattershaw, and the men who'd dropped in for a midday pint, it became clear that the mystery of the post was considered in the light of Causley's misadventure, as Miss Orchard had implied, and Love found that the details of the wandering parcel were not generally known. There was some speculation that one of Causley's sons had spiked their father's flask for a joke, and now daren't own up for fear of his life, but it wasn't serious. Confidentially, he asked Tattershaw whether Causley had in fact bought any liquor from him, and received a firm negative. Having drawn a blank at Greenwood, Love got directions to Causley's cottage, where he discussed with the postman the possibility of a reenactment that afternoon. It was decided that for accuracy's sake, Love should accompany Causley on his morning round the next day. They were to meet outside the post office at 5:30, whence Love now returned to telephone CID. Initially, the Chief Inspector was somewhat sceptical of his sergeant's proposed course of action. Love stressed that something rather peculiar did seem to have happened to Mr. Causley, and that in his opinion the best way to calm the natives was to go into the business as thoroughly as possible. Had Love at least spoken to that Swiss individual staying in the village? Mr. Leitner was absent and would not return until tomorrow. The DCI suggested that Love might be milking what was meant to be a day's easy work for a beano. He had a tendency to mix metaphors. Love asked the DCI if he would like him to return without interviewing Mr. Leitner. Nope. Now you're there, you may as well wait and talk to the yodeling plant fancier. The dead line clicked in Love's ear. Thank you, sir, he muttered, replacing the receiver.
I just kind of got drawn in. I was like, it feels like I've had a story read to me, and it's lovely.
Oh, well, I'm very glad. I'm glad. Yeah. So, what do you think then? What do you think about the plot? What do you think might be happening? Dan, any ideas?
uh, uh, well, there's the kind of like, yeah, there's the sort of missing parcel. There's the elements of this sort of like the German science stuff. Um, I'm guessing there's something going on, but it's hard to know what. And I'm not that insightful, really. But yeah, it does draw you in, and I think I just got lost when you were. I think some of the descriptive stuff is so beautiful as well, isn't it? And
Me
just the
too. Yeah.
description of the houses, the property, I could almost smell sort of like the environment, the sort of the old furniture and things like that kind of like remind me of like my grandmother's house, or um yeah, it's or those sort of stately homes that you go and visit if you can. But yeah, and then this sort of the intrigue is there, isn't it? And there's all these sort of other dynamics about, like you said earlier, about different people having different perceptions about what's going on, and then the policeman the detective kind of thinking, well, what am I doing here? And not necessarily kind of investing in it really. um yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah.
I think. I think what when the first time I read it, I was just blown away by how beautiful it is. And it's little details for me as a mum. Lemon. She likes using lemon, lemony, for this sweet sharp thing, and lemon was Maeve's favorite fruit, really. I mean, so for birthdays, she would have a luscious lemon cake. That was her favorite cake, and so this is, for me, it's the most precious thing of all. But I think for people with when it comes to your creative process, you do have to draw. I said this already, so forgive me for being repetitive if it's boring, but you do have to draw on what you know, and who you are as a person. And I think there's something, potentially anyway, quite therapeutic, in the softest sense of the word, in writing. I know people do a lot of journaling for mental health reasons. It's like having a dialogue with yourself, where you can see that you can kind of see yourself reflected a little bit in what you've written down. And when you're creating a work of fiction like this is, it's still your journaling in a way. Do you understand what I mean by that?
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because
definitely.
you're a creative
There's,
person, aren't you?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, I write music, and I think my frustration is not being able to, not feeling like I've got the sharpness of mind to write as much as I used to. So I used to, when I first became ill, I used to blog quite regularly, and about this, that, and the other, and I think I've maybe my focus has been on the podcast more recently, but I think the blogging for me has kind of taken a sideline, but mostly because sometimes I don't know what to write. I just don't have that inspiration. And then when I do come to write a blog, sometimes I just get that idea, and then it's all out there. So like I'll write something quite quickly, because it's just sort of like, yeah, that feeling like I need to write about something. And I think that's sometimes, I think I've said previously on the podcast about writing songs, it's almost a poetic thing. So sometimes it'll be very late at night when I'm get some inspiration and just write something down, and then it later turns into a song. But yeah, I think what you were saying earlier about Maeve getting all these ideas and forming things when she's resting, that's something that happens to me quite a bit in terms of like planning for the podcast, um and maybe like getting ideas for songs or whatever, but that I'm like resting, and it's like this is the time that I need to sort of take to myself and kind of recharge my batteries, or I don't even know if that's something you can do really with ME, but yeah, planned resting. That then I'm sort of like trying to rest, but then my mind, like you said, my mind's sort of sparking off different things. So it's kind of a helpful thing, but also a hindrance. But sometimes you can't switch off that, can you? And I guess that was something for Maeve, that it clearly all sort of like
Yeah, she
was
never she never
inside there, and then it
switched
sort
off.
of came out
She
later.
never could. Yeah, but I don't, I mean, I don't
Yeah.
know how anyone's supposed to switch off. I've listened to people talk about, when we kind of got the measure of what this illness is, and like, so she finished school. She was supposed to be going off to do all the things that young adults go off to do, and all of those were denied. And how do you live with that? How do you learn to live with that? Because that is the task ahead of you. And I think it's really hard. It's really, really hard. It's very painful in terms of what you've lost. Very painful, but there's more than that. I used to think she's going to become this incredibly wise person very quickly, because she's going to have to learn to become like a yogi, to be able to be 100% in the present all the time, without any expectation of the future, and to let go of everything from the past. And I mean, who achieves that? Who, really, seriously, who achieves that? I've never met anybody. I'm not a religious person. I don't seek those sorts of experiences. I don't look for religious experiences in life, but I think that I mean, I've told you before, I think that finding spiritual peace with chronic illness is absolutely essential to surviving it. Completely and utterly essential. And that, what you're doing here, what you're doing with the podcast is a contribution to that. I think it will help people. So I hope it's helping you. I hope it's not draining you too much. And we can pause at any point if you want to take a break, because this is quite a long time now, isn't it? We're into the second hour, aren't we? Well into the second hour.
Yeah. Did you have more bits that you wanted to read, or
There's
should we
loads
come
more
back
that
and
I
do
could
that another
read, and
time?
I haven't, on purpose. I didn't do anything about the end, because I want to leave people wanting to know how how it finishes, so that hopefully it will get published and get recorded and people can listen to it. But it's not there yet. It's quite hard to read because of the gaps sometimes. I don't know how to read this when there's a gap. What do I say? There's a gap here. Like break the spell.
Yeah.
There's the lovely bit that she wrote about grief, which is just beautiful. And then there's the whole bit about the position of women in 1920s. And what I love about the book is that, like lots of good historical fiction, the parallels with the present are so pertinent. So there's lots of discussion elsewhere. I'm not sure it's in the excerpts where she's talking about refugees. She's talking about the status of refugees and how we treat refugees, what it means to be a refugee, and she's physically not here, but her words and her thoughts are definitely still here, and it's still going on around us all the time. One of the characters who is introduced in the excerpt, we don't meet him, but he's introduced, is an Irish Fenian politician. But I mean, if you want to, we could do more. I would love to do more, but we can also take a break. And I'm feeling like I need to be the healthy person here to say we need to take a break, because I don't want you to be made ill.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's so easy to do too much. It's too easy to do too much. It's too stimulating. So
yeah.
we could come back and finish it another time, Dan, if that suits. I'm not going anywhere. This inquest is enormous, and winter's coming. Reading aloud in the winter is a nice thing to do. It's plenty of time. So
Yeah, well, I mean, we could put this one out, and then people might want to hear. People hopefully might want to hear more. So, Was there anything else that you wanted to add before we finish this time? Because I know
Yeah,
we could
you'd
have
asked
we
me.
could talk about the
We could talk
inquest and things,
plenty,
but
couldn't we? Yeah, plenty. Well, we could save that for the next
mm,
time, I would say, because the latest
yeah,
thing with the inquest is that we have a new coroner, and that's. I don't know where we are with the inquest. It's nearly 2 years since Maeve died, and we've had one hearing in all of that time. There's heaps of evidence. It's all very good evidence if you already know what happens to people with very severe ME. If you don't know, and of course the coroner doesn't know, and neither, strangely, perhaps not strangely, do any of the medics or the social care professionals involved in the inquest who are being asked to give witness to what happened in Maeve's care and how she died, because that's all an inquest can do. It can only find the facts, and that's good because that's what we need. We need the facts. This is my opinion, obviously, but we need the facts. We need them to be public, and that's what the inquest will do. But there are so many facts pertaining to how someone dies from very severe ME that it's going to take a lot of finding, and the law is going to take quite a lot of interpreting. And our new coroner is part-time. She's already got more to read than she can manage just to catch up with something which is already a year beyond the schedule that was originally set. You know, it was supposed to have concluded in March. It's not going to conclude quickly, and that's a good thing in the sense that it's being thorough, and it's a bad thing in the sense that there are people who I know about right now who need those facts to be out there so that change can happen. And that's always the trouble for ME, right? Is that anybody who is ill with ME can get worse. They don't know whether they're going to get worse. They don't know why they're going to get worse because they do all the right things like Maeve did, and it doesn't work. And then when you need medicine, and it's really critical that medicine steps in and does what it can, they're arguing amongst themselves, and we've got to have an end to that argument. So that's what I'm hoping from the inquest. But I can't predict the outcome, and we're still well in the weeds with it all.
Yeah, it's going to be a process, isn't it? And it's hard for you as it goes on, isn't it? Because it's waiting to have some sort of closure on it all, and I'm sure that's really hard. And I feel like I feel like as an ME community, we'd want to extend that kind of like support to you as well in terms of what you're going through. So yeah.
And I get that, Dan, and I'm going to say we need to stop now because I can see that you're tired. And if I can see it, you must be feeling really poorly.
Yeah.
So please stop.
Yeah.
And let's do some more. It'd be lovely for me if we could do some more in a few months' time, because like I said, there's not going to be a hurry with the inquest. It's going to be winter, and a bit of a story over a podcast could be quite nice. So